What is it? It is passion and style, heritage and diversity, creativity and innovation, but there's so much more to it. Everyday visionaries, original and refined, stubbornly authentic, with unmatched quality on our mind. Every time you live it, wear it, feel it, taste it, you'll know it's true. It is our brand, cool and unique. Italy is simply extraordinary. Be it.
Tout est possible, il n'y a pas de limite. Ouais.
So, perfect. Welcome to the last discussion round of today. And it's going to be, I guess, quite a serious one, hopefully also a bit optimistic at the end, because we're going to talk a lot about money. Welcome to How Much is Enough? Fair Work in the Short Film Festival Circuit, a call for action. So how the evening is going to go, first of all, we're going to have a keynote speech from Benjamin Gruber, and he's going to give us some insights on what's been happening in Austria, because they've done some pretty amazing stuff recently. After that, we're going to have 5 minutes break, and then we have a discussion with a few more panelists. So first of all, welcome on stage, Benjamin. I'll leave the stage again and see you later.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Hello and welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to my talk on fair wages, fair working conditions, under the title How Much is Enough? Thank you, Enrico Vanucci, for putting this important topic on this year's agenda. As you can read up on the screen, I'm from the Forum Õsterreichischer Filmfestivals, which is a lobby organization of Austrian film festivals. And we represent, or we have in this association, the biggest Austrian film festivals, but also very small film festivals, so it's a very diverse group of film festivals. And the forum, as we call it, is a place where film festival directors and managers come to exchange ideas and talk about common topics or common issues. I myself have experience in working at film festivals, both at the management level. I used to be the managing director of Vienna Shorts for 6 years, but also I worked, of course, at film festivals at many different levels, taking tickets, working at the box office, or running production departments. Now I work, or I see film festivals from both an outside and an inside perspective. I have 2 jobs. I work for the Forum Õsterreichischer Filmfestivals, where I'm a co-spokesperson together with my colleague Anna. And my second job is I work for an Austrian feature film distributor and cinema in Vienna. So coming from my festival experience, I know the frenzy of 60-hour work weeks and also like this exciting feeling of having an opening night. But I also got to know a bit more of the dark side of working and of self-exploitation. And I know the toll that it can take on one's physical and mental health. And then when I had this change in perspective, going out of the film festival work and working for a different part of the film industry and also representing film festivals in this lobby group, I really, again, realized how important fair wage and fair working conditions are for film festival workers. So now that that you know a bit more about myself, I'd also like to get to know you a bit with just 2 simple questions. Who here works for a film festival? And just off the top of your head, do you think you get a fair compensation for your work? Who here thinks they get fairly compensated? All right. Well, I thought so. Okay. So now that we know each other a bit, let's dive in. I have some slides prepared. Let's just see how this works. Oh, yeah. This is our forum logo. Okay, so in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about the current fair pay initiatives in Austria that come both from the political level, but also from the cultural sector, and what the positive aspects are, and what some of the open questions and problems are that I see with this initiative. I'm going to give you an insight on what we as a festival association do, and how we work together on this issue of fair pay and fair wages, and how we came up with fair wage recommendations for Austrian film festivals. And also really what some of the controversial discussions were in this process. And also I want to try to think on what is going to happen next and what really it needs from all film festivals to move forward in this topic. I've loosely structured this talk in 4 topics, which is the Austrian situation, fair wages, the work of the forum, and the question, what now? And then in the second part, in the panel discussion, I'd also be very interested in you sharing some of your experiences when it comes to working conditions in your specific countries, because also in the panel we have, it's very Austria and Germany focused. But to start, I want to paint the picture for the Austrian film festival scene and working and funding conditions. So in Austria, the arts and culture funding makes up about 0.5 percentage point of the whole budget of the Austrian federal government. And of this budget, which is about 550 million euros, 1.2 million euros or 0.2% of the whole arts and culture budget go to 24 film festivals. In addition to funding from the federal government, Austrian film festivals also, some of them get funding from the media scheme, and they get funding from regional and local governments, and also from collecting societies. So the initial reason for festivals to get together and form this forum of film festivals was to have a bigger piece in this funding cake, so to speak. And the share has gotten bigger in the last 10 years since the forum has been around, but it's still far from being enough to implement fair wages for all festivals. So we see that the arts and culture funding in Austria is not nothing, but we also see that film festivals are far from being the highest or even a high priority when it comes to funding. So now that we know about funding, how does the working rights situation look in Austria? And I think one could say on the first glance it seems pretty well, even though today railway workers are striking, and also I think that's a good or a healthy sign of workers' rights, that there is this possibility. Of all Austrian employees, around 97–98% are covered by collective bargaining agreements. And for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, collective bargaining agreement basically means that there is an institution that represents the employers, which can be anything from, we heard yesterday, a representative of the Chamber of Commerce. In Austria, it's mostly the Chamber of Commerce that represents employers. And then you have an institution that represents the employees, typically that's the unions. And they get together and they negotiate wages and working conditions for a sector of the economy, for instance, for cinema workers or railway workers. And these 97–98% of employees being covered by those collective bargaining agreements, it sounds like a lot, and in fact it is if you only look at the percentage points. But still, the 2 to 3% of people that are not covered by collective bargaining agreements amount to around 100,000 people in Austria that are employed but not covered by such an agreement. So what decides whether or not you're covered by a collective bargaining agreement? It basically depends on whether your employer is registered with the Chamber of Commerce in Austria. And it probably doesn't come as a surprise to you that film festivals, who are by and large non-profit organizations, are not registered with the Chamber of Commerce, and therefore festival workers are not covered by collective agreements. So what does it mean if you as an employer are not subject to a collective agreement in Austria? In Austria, we get our salaries 14 times a year, which is nice. So twice a year you get double your monthly salary, but only if you're subject to a collective agreement. In Austria, unions are fighting for a minimum wage of currently 2,000 euros, but again, only if you're covered by a collective agreement. So for all those employed or for all those governed by contracts that don't fall under the collective agreement, employers can pay employees basically what they want. There is no, I mean, there is a lower limit, but that's what's called the limit of decency. So you can pay people half the amount of a comparable collective agreement. That would be for cinema workers. Currently, I think it's 8 euros 20 cents for people who take tickets. So basically, as a festival, you could pay 4 euros 10 cents per hour per person, and it would still be legal. And the argument is, what the problem is in Austria, there's no minimum wage. And the argument is always because there are 97–98% of the people covered by collective agreements anyways, there's no need for a minimum wage. So naturally, I got really excited for the European minimum wage initiative because I thought, okay, if we can't manage to introduce a minimum wage in Austria ourselves, maybe the EU will step in and help us out. It was only to find out that the reasoning when the Fair Wage Initiative was introduced behind excluding certain countries from this minimum wage is the same as in Austria. Countries who have a large coverage of collective agreements are exempt from the minimum wage. So we will not have a minimum wage in Austria that covers all employees. And in fact, the Austrian government, I think, made their agreement to the minimum wage initiative on the European level contingent on them introducing also this this paragraph of excluding countries with a large coverage of collective agreements. So as it seems, we need to take matters into our own hands. And this is where it gets tricky, I think, because when it comes to film festivals, I think sometimes it's not clear who is supposed to fight for fair wages and who it is that this fight is brought to, and if even the term fight is the correct term in this context. The question is it this classical fight between workers and employers, when in many cases festival workers are highly intrinsically motivated people that have a deep understanding for the financial struggles of the festivals they work for? And also, how do you raise demands when you know your employer has no money? Or is it the fight of workers and employers together for a bigger share of the funding cake? But then again, why should employees who do not get a say in how the money then is distributed in the film festival or how it is spent, what does motivate them to fight for more resources for the employer? Or is it the responsibility of film festival leaders and directors to set minimum standards for compensation? But how do you set standards that all festivals can adhere to without running into the problem of festivals going bankrupt because they cannot afford the minimum standards you set? And these are some of the questions Austrian film festivals and festival workers have been asking themselves over the past years. And frankly, there are no clear answers, of course, and I certainly don't have the answers to all those questions myself. But I can only say that I do believe it is in the best interest of film festival makers and directors to work towards establishing fair working conditions and putting all their weight behind the idea that public funding institutions have to A, take responsibility for the working conditions in the projects they fund, sorry, and B, increase the funding level of film festivals to make fair wages possible. Because the status quo only results in a constantly high turnover of, in a constantly high employee turnover and a constant brain drain. I mean, all of you who have worked in film festivals know this, or might have experienced this, that people are only able to work for a film festival to some point or to some time span, and then you have to recruit new people, or you as a worker have to find some other employment. And this ultimately jeopardizes the quality of a film festival. And the status quo also means that only people who can afford to can work at film festivals. This also, in my opinion, adds the question of the diversity or the diverse makeup of the people employed in film festivals, and also raises the question of equal pay. And this all sounds very bleak, and I'm sure you know a lot of those topics, but the situation in Austria also gives some reason to hope. After years of petitions, panel discussions, and press releases pushing for more money, for fair wages, and after countless initiatives by both festivals and other cultural lobby groups, the topic of fair wages seems to have gained the attention of Austrian politics. In 2020, triggered by the pandemic, but also by a change in political personnel, the federal government announced a Fair Wage Initiative for the cultural sector, and specifically for those institutions that are not covered by a collective agreement. A special funding tool was developed to help bridge the so-called fair pay gap, so the difference between the actual wages and whatever would be is imagined as being fair, to help festivals allocate more resources towards wages. But of course, this process is far from ideal. The federal government is committed to bridging this fair wage gap, but of course only for projects that it co-funds. So there's still a lot of projects that don't get funding by the federal government who are left alone basically with this problem. And for film festivals, funding from the federal government typically is less than 50% of their budget, and the federal government is only committed to contributing to bridging this fair wage gap in the proportion that it funds the film festivals. So if a film festival gets, say, 20% of its funding from the federal government government only feels responsible for 20% of this fair wage gap. To bring other funding institutions on board for this initiative, the federal government released the Fair Pay Strategy in June of this year, but this strategy remains without a time frame and without concrete goals. So it's, as I said, far from ideal. So in all this, what is the role of the Forum and what have we achieved so far? The Forum was founded, as I said, 10 years ago as a platform for exchange between festivals and the lobby for better funding for film festivals. And also as a platform for festival makers to talk about issues they have in common, such as fair wages or green festivals. And the Forum brings together 23 festivals which are vastly different. You have your volunteer festivals in the countryside on the one hand, and you also have Austria's biggest festival, the Biennale. And those festivals have, of course, vastly different resources and also different approaches when it comes to political lobbying. The first phase was basically a forming phase where everybody got together and tried to figure out how to work together and what the common or shared interests are. And this phase was followed by talks by the then speakers of the Forum with a lot of political representatives in order to establish rapport and make the concerns of the film festivals heard. This phase now bears fruit because in Austria we are now at the stage where policymakers will actually approach the Forum whenever it comes to issues that concern film festivals. Next for the Forum in 2016 was the first ever film festival report done in Austria, which was a study that combined quantitative and qualitative methods in order to gain insights into the financial situation of film festivals, the effect film festivals have on the economy, and also strategic prospects for film festivals, but also one aspect was the working conditions for festival workers. So a small part of the study was also the demographic makeup and social situation of festival workers. The study found that only 8% of workers listed festivals as their main source of income. In my opinion, this hints at a widespread precarious employment conditions. The result also showed that half the respondents had been working at festivals for less than 3 years, hinting at either a very young sample or also at very precarious working conditions that don't allow people to work at film festivals for a long time or even have a career in film festivals. The pandemic has highlighted, among many other things, that sectors where predominantly women work are also sectors that have the lowest wages. And this is also true for film festivals, as the study shows that more than 2/3 of festival workers in Austria are women, adding to the questions I've raised before, the question of wage inequality. For the qualitative part, festival makers were asked many different questions to assess the state festivals in Austria were in. Most striking for me was that when film festival makers were asked whether or not their festivals were possible without volunteer work, an overwhelming majority said no, they would not be possible without volunteer work. This for me only means that the film festival system is in need of fundamental changes. So against this backdrop, the Forum has started engaging in an intense discussion process at the beginning of this year. For all the reasons I've mentioned above, festival makers were aware of the topic, not least because many of them are subject to precarious working conditions themselves. But the road ahead was not clear. So in the Forum, we started a process of a series of workshops at the beginning, of which we tried to evaluate the status quo and also how far off the festivals were from existing fair pay recommendations. And also for collective agreements, even though we're not subject to collective agreements, there are some that would be theoretically applicable to film festivals. So we did an internal survey comparing the wage level for different festival jobs to corresponding or similar categories in the collective agreement of film and music industry, and also compared it to existing fair pay recommendations by other cultural lobby groups. And what we found was to be expected, but disillusioning nevertheless. I will not go into detail about the findings because the survey was always meant to be an internal survey only, and I'm sure as people who have worked with collections of festivals or festival associations, or any association really know it's important to sometimes be very transparent internally, but then again to not always make this data publicly available. So what we found was that this came as no surprise, but it was disillusioning nevertheless. That some festivals were far off and some were a little closer to fair wage recommendations, but virtually no festival reached fair wage levels. So now that we knew where we were at, the scope of the next steps became clearer. We were not going to introduce a mandatory fair pay scheme on the spot, because this simply would have meant that we had festivals within our group that would just not be able to adhere to these conventions. So the next step was for the festivals to come together to figure out what fair wages mean when it comes to film festivals. The collective agreement I've mentioned, the one for the film and music industry and existing fair wage recommendations, were a good starting point, but did not reflect the particularities of festival work. So we went about and adapted and tweaked existing models so that they were useful for film festivals. This needed a lot of back and forth between festivals, as we wanted all festivals to be able to get behind the salary table. And I'll just show you an excerpt of what we came up with. It's in German, obviously, and you can access this, like the whole document. It goes on, it describes all the roles at the film festivals. It's on our website, film-festivals.at, where you can also download this document. So what we did was basically the same as you would do in any collective agreement. You'd find groups of tasks or of positions that of course it's always a subjective categorization that you would put in the same category. We did it on the basis of responsibility, or of what we thought of were jobs that were equally, had equal responsibility or levels of responsibility. And then in the final step of this process, we came back to the beginning, to the evaluation stage, and we started the discussion of, okay, now we have this fair wage scheme, what are we going to do with it? And on the one end of the spectrum was the idea to use this salary table just like as an informal internal recommendation or orientation for film festivals. And on the other end of the spectrum was the idea to use it as a binding mandatory minimum wage for festivals. But as I said, the The latter idea was quickly tossed out as it was clear that introducing such a minimum wage scheme at this level would have meant basically bankruptcy for a lot of film festivals, as film festivals would not be able to afford the scheme. But the Forum did want to go beyond like just not publishing this and having it as an internal document. So we decided on two things. A, all festivals committed to calculating their budgets in according with the salary scheme. And B, the scheme was to be made public, accompanied by a press release and talks with funding institutions. Our goal in using this scheme to calculate the staff costs was basically or primarily to show funding institutions how much funding it would take for film festivals to be able to pay fair wages, and also to highlight the value of cultural work. By publishing the fair wage table, we wanted to keep the pressure up and also the discussion around the topic going, and also to give festival workers the chance to see the scheme and react to it. The fair wage recommendation has been public for a month now, and we're still in ongoing talks with funding institutions. And of course, all our problems have not magically disappeared since then, and funding has not increased, but the reactions so far have been positive. Okay, so what we've learned so far is, so collective agreements are good if you can get them, but if not, at least in Austria, you're subject to basically arbitrary wage schemes. We as a forum found that finding out about your own festival and other festivals around you and gathering data, and preferably on a European level, is a very powerful tool when it comes to arguing your position, especially in front of funding institutions. And in our case, both with the 2016 study and then with this internal survey, it showed that also the extent of precarious working conditions at the festivals, and also provided us with some like hard evidence we could then go to funding institutions to argue our case. And also coming together as vastly different festivals and agreeing on fair wages can be a very tough process. But it gives your position a lot more power if you are a group of festivals than if you were to argue your case alone, and if you were to stand for fair wages alone. And just how much power it gives us, we are going to find out in the next months or even years. And I think for me, the number one takeaway from this process is that things move incredibly slowly when it comes to these things. And especially when what you want to achieve is contingent on policy changes. And it also involves a lot of luck, basically, because if the wrong people are in power, you will never have a chance. So in my view, you need to establish a structure that ensures continuous lobby work for the cause of film festivals, that allows you to work on the same topic for a number of months or even years. Okay, so what now? Where do we go from here in Austria in general? To be honest, we as a forum don't really know the next steps in detail yet, but I'll give you my best guess, also mixed in with some of my personal preferences, so the next part is not all official forum policy. I think it's great that Austrian politics have discovered this topic of fair wages for themselves. It's a topic that many people have been trying to push for a number of years. But it comes at the worst and at the best times imaginable at the same time. What I mean is, it comes at the worst time because all the gains that have been made in the past months when it comes to public funding are almost instantly annihilated because of the galloping inflation. And for the same reason, it is the best of times, because without this increase in funding, cultural institutions and the people working for it would be even harder hit by the inflation and would even fall into a deeper budgetary hole. And to make serious progress, I think that we need to follow a two-pronged strategy on a national and a European level. And the first thing is, for me, the most important thing, even though it's probably the least attainable thing, and that's automatic index matching for public festival funding. Because when everything becomes 10% more expensive, as is the case now, and public funding is the biggest part of your budget, then of course public funding should also become 10% more. And in that regard, it's basically a no-brainer, but on the other hand, it's like very hard to argue in front of funding institutions. But I'm convinced that there will be no chance for sustainable fair wages if there's not at least some form of index matching for public funding. And that also ties in with the second part, and that is, I think we are in need of a collective agreement for festival workers, and on the other hand, a very active festival workers union as a negotiating partner. I talked a lot about the benefits for workers from a collective agreement, but employers also can benefit because they can then, together with the union, tailor the general working conditions, such as overtime and weekend work, more to the specific needs of film festivals. And the third thing is it needs a clear roadmap, and we need to work out together with funding institutions a way for all the festivals to reach this level of funding and this volume of a budget to allow for fair wages, because it is in no one's interest, and certainly not in the Forum's interest, for us to introduce a collective agreement and then have festivals go bankrupt left and right because they cannot afford it. Because as it is in Austria, there's only one festival that now adheres to the fair wage scheme that I've just put up on the screen, and that's obviously the biggest and the highest funded festivals. So all other festivals could simply not afford this. And going back to the first and the second point, the index matching and the collective agreement, those are really very much linked, because if you have a situation where you have a collective agreement, that will also involve yearly negotiations on how much you will increase the salary of the festival workers. And if the funding is then not increased, at least in the same amount, you will, in a matter of a couple of years, simply be not able to afford any more wages. And on a more European level, I think it needs more knowledge about the social situation and wage levels of festival workers in the European Union. I mean, it doesn't have to be limited to European Union, but I think it makes sense to focus it on Europe, because the basic conditions, I think, are in many countries very different and comparable. The example of the Austrian Film Festival Forum in Austria has convinced me that festivals gain a lot of strength when they share information and data about themselves, at least among themselves, but also with the public, and also when they have a chance to exchange experiences and learn from other festivals. And the second European point is I still think that it needs a European minimum wage as an unconditional lower bound for wages. So whether you are covered by a collective agreement or not really should not be have an effect whether you are entitled to a basic, not a universal income, but like a basic minimum wage. And if we don't manage to get the European Parliament to sponsor such a bill, or as we have seen, if it in the end turns out not to cover film festivals, I think we as festivals should come up with European wage guidelines, and the basic model, I think, can be pretty much like the one that the European Union agreed on when it comes to calculating the different levels for the different countries. When you take the mean wage of a country and try to balance the wages out. All right, so those are my final remarks. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to some questions afterwards.
Thank you very much. We have a 5-minute break. I don't know what time it is, but I'm sure you all know when 5 minutes are over, so see you back in 5. the lights are off, so I guess we're going to continue. So, thank you very much, Benjamin, for this speech. Now we can discuss, just for anybody who's maybe entered this room after the keynote speech, we're talking about money, how much is enough, about fair wages and fair work in the festival sector. And now we are 5 people on the stage, and I would just like to introduce the panelists very briefly. So next to Benjamin, we have Skadi Loist. Skadi, you're an assistant professor for production cultures and audiovisual media industries at the Film University Babelsberg Konrad Wolf. You do research on film festivals, film circulation, labor conditions, sustainability and diversity in the screen industries. And also very important, I think, for this panel today, you conducted a survey for the Fair Festival Award in 2021, together with the work group Festival Labor in the German Labor Union. Verdi, welcome to the stage. To my left side, we have Katja Wiederspan. She's a film curator and translator and member of the queer feminist translation collective Gender et Alia. I have two, sorry, only one Alia. You're also heading the program coordination department of the Biennale, Vienna International Film Festival, since 2002. You're the co-organizer of Queer Tactics, Queer Feminist Film Festival in Vienna since 2019, and since 2022 you're also the co-organizer of Red Lotus Asian Film Festival Vienna, so you have a lot of festival experience. Also important for this panel, of course, is you're one of the founding members of the Austrian initiatives Fair Festival Work Now, and you're a member of the Austrian Union with a YOU union, advocating for the representation of self-employed cultural workers. Welcome. So I'm sure you have a lot to say as well. In between Skadi and Katja, we have Sanne Yehul from the UK, so this is our non-German Austrian part on this panel. Sanne is the co-director of Glasgow Short Film Festival. You're also a freelance writer, conversation host and curator. You have previously worked in broadcast production, script development in print and media, and you also work with the distribution company Square Eyes. They focus on short films and most recently also feature films. And on the left, I'm just going to briefly introduce you again. We have Benjamin Gruber, who's the cultural manager and administrator. You used to be the managing director of Vienna Shorts from 2012 to 2018. You're now the financial officer at Stadtkino Film Distribution and Cinema since 2019, and you're also now the spokesperson for the Austrian Film Festival Association in 2022. Welcome. My name is Anne Gaschwitz. I'm the co-director of Filmfest Dresden and part of the Prodi di Domani selection committee in Locarno, and this panel is a collaboration with the Short Film Conference. So Short Film Conference, as you probably all know, is the Association for Film Festivals worldwide. We're going to have a discussion for about 40-45 minutes, and after that we will also open up the floor for questions or also discussion, because you also wanted to know a bit more about the more international scale of things. Of course, we are not just going to talk about the Austrian or German side of things. And I also would like you just to make sure, we might have some filmmakers in the audience. We are only focusing on festival work and workers today. We also, of course, all know that fair pay also includes filmmakers, but that's not the point of discussion today. So we focus on the festivals for now. So I'm going to delve right in. I have a question for you that we might be able to carry through the discussion. So as far as I know, none of us are getting paid for this panel today. And yet we're here on a panel on fair pay. So the question is, where did it all go wrong? Who wants to start?
A very good point, actually.
Right?
Yeah, I was a bit surprised to be invited without any mention of the framework of conditions of my invite. But on the other hand, I have to say I feel privileged because I get my travel and I get my accommodation and I'm free to see films at the Torino Film Fest. So for me, since I'm wearing many shoes, it kind of pays off, and I think that's a model which many of us use to make sense of all the unpaid work we're doing. Secondly, I'm a union member, and as a union member, I do a lot of unpaid work because that's political work, and this is basically why I decided to come here, to strongly vote for, or rather introduce the idea to the interested audience that union membership is possible. You can do it, even if you're not employed, which applies to me. I'm not employed. I have been working for the Biennale for over 20 years and saw the need to become a union member because the artistic direction of the Biennale changed, and I was not very sure whether I would lose my job or not, and therefore thought it might be wise to organize myself a bit of legal support. As we could see from Rotterdam, for example, long-term freelance contracts do not guarantee that you are not kicked out at some point. For me, it didn't happen. I'm still working at the Biennale, and as we heard from Benjamin, the Biennale is the only Austrian festival that actually implemented the fair pay measures that you talked about. So since this year, I feel I'm sort of well paid. Therefore, the second message I brought you is good working conditions are possible. Fight for them.
We're going to delve into them, I hope, a little bit on. How about you guys? I guess you're also not getting paid for this panel? You need to turn it on.
Yes, no. Well, I feel like since I'm not working for a festival, maybe I can also find a good excuse, kind of like Katja maybe, to either go the very noble route of saying, well, I want to fight for the good fight and I have a salary coming out of a different sector at the university, which is also publicly paid sector. That would be the noble way to go. And the other one would be maybe also arguing with symbolic capital and research and all the things I get to know here and stay in the network. So I think that's two ways to argue why that is still feasible, even though it is work and even though it is additional work. Because while traveling, I was still doing my emails for my regular job, like everybody else probably also. So, yeah.
I think you mentioned something very important, that I think you work for an institution, so you have a fixed salary. So do I. I mean, I don't get a fair wage, but I have a salary that comes in every month. How is it for you, Sanne? Because I don't think you have. Do you have a fixed salary? I don't know actually.
I have a part-time fixed salary.
Oh, that.
And then freelance otherwise. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I kind of would echo what they say with regards to the panel. And I think in the past I never questioned it, because I think there was this assumption of if we travel somewhere, if we get the accommodation offer somewhere, then that's okay. And maybe there's an argument to be made for that if you are on a fixed salary, because you are being paid still, you're still here as part of your job. But I've only really realized, well, I think the last few years have changed a lot. While we were doing stuff online, like I think a lot of this has been pushed forward a little bit, but it's also made me realize that before that happened, the same wasn't extended to freelance. Like if a freelancer would be on a panel at my festival, it would be the same. They would be subject to the same circumstances. So like now with a pandemic behind us, I'm mind blown that we ever let that pass. But yeah, I mean, I don't, as someone who works part-time freelance, obviously I'm here.
It's Italy.
And I appreciate it all very much. But yeah, I'm in a position where I can say yes, still to an extent, and that might change. But and I'm also surprised at myself and others that at the things that we say yes to.
Scott, do you want to add something?
Yeah, can I ask a question back to all of us? Who asked being paid?
That's the next question, yes, about responsibility. Benjamin, oh, you got paid?
I don't get paid, and I didn't ask, but I also get paid for both my jobs, working for the distribution company and the Forum, and I think the pay for the Forum could be a fair wage, but I think it is a question I discussed yesterday with Laura from Vienna Shorts when we had drinks, is the question of who can afford to work for a film festival, because I think there are two ways you can afford it. Either you have like someone who backs you, who gives you money, be that a spouse or parents or whatever, or the second way is that you pay for it by in the future. Like you don't get a pension, for instance, or you get a very small pension. That is, you don't have a wage that is adequate, so you live in a shared flat or something like that. You deprive yourself of luxuries. And I think this question of who can afford to work for a film festival is one that really also interests me, because I think it limits us also when we talk about who can work for a festival.
Yeah, maybe we can get into this a little bit. Benjamin, you already gave us a really good overview of what initiatives are there in Austria right now. I would like to go a little bit more to Germany now, to Skadi, because we have a similar initiative in Germany, and yet not the same. Could you just briefly explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, maybe the main difference, the way that Benjamin explained it, the Forum is actually an organization by the festivals, so like the festival organizations, the festival directors, and we have one like that as well now, since 3-4 years, the AG Film Festival, which is a similar lobby organization in a way, but the actual work on labor conditions comes from the festival workers themselves. There was actually an initiative older than the AG Film Festival, which started 2016 after 4 curators talked amongst each other and realized they're all in the same terrible boat, and thought they should do something about it, started an initiative, a lot of conversations, which then led into becoming an actual work group in a union in Verdi in Germany. And since then, try to really work within the union and also collaborate with other arts fields in a way. So not just work with festival and film festival, but also, let's say, theater, but also general arts, music, and so on. And maybe to explain the survey we did a couple of years ago, the idea of the union work group was also, well, what can you actually achieve if you're, a few handfuls of people who are overworked and underpaid? And so they started to think, well, it would be good to not only have a negative message, but try to do the positive way, and came up with the Fair Festival Award. It's actually kind of a rip-off of the Fair Film Award. And to basically try to say these are the festivals that have a good structure and pay fairly, and have good also conditions in terms of labor, but also in terms of how you can get involved, what you can actually achieve there. And that we used to start a survey to basically try to reach festival workers, saying, well, what kind of contract do you have? How long have you been working for? What kind of education do you have? What type of contract do you actually have? Are you a freelancer? Are you an employee? When do you get your contract? How many hours of rest time do you actually have? Like, most people wouldn't know there should be 11 hours. And those kind of things. We try to, on the one hand, educate people, also tell them, you know, like Katja said, join up, unionize, and also find out which festivals work well. It's kind of like a ranking. Then when you see the ones showing up very low, maybe that's not good advertising. So yeah, that is basically one thing that was that's happening, like the work on the union side and the work on the festival organization side from both ends.
And I think the difference is that in Germany it's already part of the union, and I think in Austria that hasn't happened yet, right? But are you in talks with unions, or how can the union become a part of this?
Well, as I said, you can become member of the union. I am member of any time. It's very easy. The problem is the Austrian workers are strangely hesitant to become union members. And I see a similar tendency in Austria, and I think it's a bit a generational problem that younger people are not really very trustful when it comes to the work of the unions. And also, I think not much is known about the purpose of being a union member.
So now it's your chance.
What we do is, a lot of like advertising. I think one other big problem is that festival workers tend to have short-term contracts. So the expectation to change something in the organization is not very high, because most of them move on after 3-4 months. I'm an exception, because I'm paid for 9 months at the same festival. So I have been working for decades to improve the conditions there, but most of the workers in this field can't. And this exactly would be a good argument to become a union member, because independently of your current workplace, you can work on improving your working conditions.
I was just going to ask about the benefits of a union. So, because it is a union, it is supposed to actually strengthen your what you want and help you get fair working conditions. So I think that's, maybe we need to make that more clear for people. I've been telling Skadi, I think, for a few weeks now that I'm going to join the union. I still haven't done it. Maybe after today.
Do it.
I know. I need to sign up. Sanne, you are from a festival in Scotland, and the things are a little bit different in the UK right now. So we've probably all heard of Edinburgh going into administration along with Filmhouse, and I think around 100 people got laid off, if I'm not mistaken. Are there any such initiatives as like we've just heard about in the UK to strengthen festival work, or what's your experience there?
There are there are initiatives and there are unions, but it's very fractured, and there's very little coming from it. And I think particularly the exhibition sector is sort of the lowest on the priority list there. Like the main union that we could be part of, and I will tell everyone to join a union all the time, but the reason I'm not part of this union is because they've blacklisted so many people I know. Like employers have blacklisted so many people I know because they've joined that union. That union, I mean, yeah, it's like it's the UK. It's
that should not be the case.
And these people, this is like people like BBC and stuff. So, but the problem with that particular union is that they're very much focused on production. So it's mainly like TV and film production. The exhibition sector, anyone you speak to doesn't really get very far with them. There's not much being done for that sector, partly because the sector is very fragmented and there's no guidelines or standardization around work, really, in the way that production has, even though it's a really tricky area, there is much more of that. And then there have been initiatives for a few smaller unions that focus on precarious workers, so that'll be like anyone like us, but also gig economy in general. I don't think that gets lots of traction. There's one that started that was specifically for cultural work, which again I think is just so small that it didn't get the weight. So there are now conversations with a lot of people I know that are about joining one of the main trade unions. And then having a conversation there about how that can, how they can kind of lobby for us, I suppose. But that's not in place at the moment. There are things like, right now, at the same time as this is happening, there's This Way Up, which is the main exhibition conference in the UK, that's happening right now in Scotland. And the entire program is full of conversations like these, and that happens every year. And every year nothing changes. And I think, it's also just a completely different economical situation where things have, Ben and I were talking about this briefly earlier, that like, when you're in a context where the baseline social security is so much lower, it's really hard to for people to advocate and for people to take action because the risks are just much higher. And I think, and the film house thing ties into that incredibly, but after our 12 years of austerity, you notice it, the kind of action that was there 10 years ago isn't there because everyone's run down, there's no space to do it. So there have been conversations around this. There's obviously people within funding bodies that are very sympathetic towards that. It'd be really bad if there weren't. But at the same time, what is really telling in the way that the exhibition sector isn't served by that union, our main funder has working groups for every screen department apart from exhibition. So now there's the chat of do we need let's start a working group for exhibition, but the response to it is it's very low. There's also a level of union busting going on, I think, or what you could call union busting from funders, where we have proposed initiatives, we've proposed, we'll do a survey and have a collective response from festivals of a smaller size that aren't institutional, and you get discouraged from doing it. So it's a really, it is a hostile environment.
So people who have worked with or are in unions or work with unions, how can we prevent things like that happening? Because this is quite precarious and dangerous for the cultural sector. Benjamin, you mentioned earlier a European minimum wage, which I would also like to know a little bit more about. How can we implement a European minimum wage? Because I know the UK has a minimum wage. I don't know where it is at the moment, but how can we have one that is fair to everybody? Would that be something that would make it better, or how can we better ourselves? Any ideas?
So I think in some ways in Austria we have a very good social security net, but when it comes to minimum wage, I think this really is a blind spot because it allows because really as I said, there are really no limits for what people can be paid in film festivals. No lower limits. And this is, to me this is amazing in a negative way and unacceptable. And what was put forth by the European Union initially, I think, was an unconditional minimum wage. But then countries like Austria lobbied for it to change in a way that countries where a lot of the employees are covered by collective agreements are exempt from this regulation, which is something I still don't understand, because also what I hear from the unions is that they always argue against the minimum wage because they say it undermines their position when they negotiate a collective agreement. And to this day, I don't understand the position of the union that they argue against the minimum wage, against this baseline, say 1,800 or 2,000 euro minimum wage. And of course, obviously, this will be a different figure for every country, and you will have to, the minimum wage as it works now on the European Union level is calculated in accordance with, I think it's 60% of the mean income of a country, and you could do a similar thing. But I don't understand the position of unions, and Katja, I don't know if you know anything about this aspect of the union positioning, that they're against minimum wage.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Well, I think it's a bit different at the small section of the union I am part of, because this is on the one hand film production and on the other hand film exhibition, and they are well aware of the fact that there's no collective agreement for festival workers, and therefore, at least as a transition phase, it is very clear that there's no alternative, because there won't be a collective agreement tomorrow. It's clear. Therefore, I think, it depends. It really depends on the sector. It really depends on the sector. What I wanted to talk about in response to your question, how can we better ourselves and our festivals? For me, this is all also very much about a change in the structure of how film festivals are organized, because when I mention the word co-determination, something that is very common in any industrial sector, but film festivals or film production, everybody gets the creeps, because co-determination, this means the artistic director of our festival doesn't have the liberty anymore to decide what she or he wants. Yes, exactly. When it concerns our working conditions, not, And for me, if everybody was striving for this, democratization of our organizations, there would be change, because people would be used to discussing how we can improve. But so far, it's a very, how can I say, I find myself in individual conversations with colleagues whom I support to negotiate for better wages, but there's no collective discussion at the festival I'm working for.
Yeah, Scotty.
I would also say it depends what kind of contract you have, because that has, whether you're a freelancer, then the whole regulatory body behind that is very different from when you're an employee and we talk about minimum wages. So from what I learned talking to my the union colleagues, I'm also not part of that union because I'm an academic and I'm in a different union, but they mentioned, for instance, the main problem in arts and culture is being a freelancer. For the way the rules go, that most of the time you are paid for a product. So you're, for instance, they argue that for musicians now you get paid for the performance, but all the invisible labor of practicing and keeping your instruments or technology up, your administrative jobs and all that to keep everything going around is usually invisible labor and not calculated. And there is one thing that the Verdi Union is trying to push right now, which is called a base wage, or Basishonorar, where they really say very clearly that's not supposed to be a minimum wage, but rather a way to actually start calculating all those invisible parts of your job, and then have a different way to calculate, say, this and that should cost at least this amount, because you should also be able to pay for your office and health insurance and social security and all that included. And that's one thing that they're pushing for the general arts sector. Another thing that they're, speaking of EU regulations, that they are kind of hopeful about is that finally the cartel law is changed, so that there is now a differentiation between whether you are a company in the automobile industry, for instance, or I don't know, and you would talk to your competitors and talk about what something should cost. That would fall under the cartel rule. But if you're a translator or a curator talking to another self-employed person and you're just on your own, that is not the same. So that is finally now apparently changing to, you are actually allowed to collaborate in a way or come to agreements or to talk amongst each other. I think that's a really big thing, like for self-employed or freelance people. And coming back to the minimum wage issue, I know from a few examples, for instance, Filmfest Hamburg, already a few years ago now, had the blessing and the curse that they had to pay all their employees minimum wage because they're a city company. So, the way your festival is set up as an organization or institutional legal entity also might come with certain regulations, and because they belonged to the city, they had to pay minimum wage as any public institution, which is great, but then your budget doesn't rise, so that means how do you what do you leave out? And I think that's exactly what Benjamin said about where, on the one hand, we want to argue for this, and on the other hand, how do you separate, or no, how do you verteilen?
Distribute, yes.
Yeah, how do you distribute the pie, so to speak? Because in reality, I don't think it's going to grow a lot. It's just going to be redistributed, and that's exactly why I think you have to work from all different sides.
I think this also comes down to responsibility, and what you said there is really important, because we can have all the great tables and what money we should have and what is the minimum we should get. We all know what we should get, but the question is, where do we get it from, and whose responsibility is it to make sure we get it? I don't know, maybe back to you, Sanna. Do you have any idea on who should be responsible to pay fair wages? What could festivals do to make it better? Should we cut our program? Should I just next time demand a fee to moderate? Or could it work? Or do we need to go into politics? How do the funding institutions come into this? There's a lot of questions, I think. And where does the money come from overall? It's not going to magically increase either overall, I guess.
I've had some conversations about this over the pandemic, particularly in Scotland and the UK, and it's not an opinion everyone agrees with by far. But I think, especially for sort of non-venue organisations and festivals aren't attached to any venues that are usually very small in our context, at least. You can have all these conversations about fair pay, and it goes hand in hand with staff care as well, right? So I think in those situations, at least in the context I'm speaking from, I think funders should have more responsibility than they're taking, because if we don't have, we're too small to have HR structures. We're too small to have anything that could be a space for conflict resolution or pay negotiation. They just, and everyone's sort of in the same boat. So I think there would be an argument for funders to have to take that role, or at least make sure that there's something separate set up to provide that. Because I don't see how else you can do that. I think there should be a responsibility from funders. If there is no, I'm speaking from a case where there is no union representation, right? There's none of these associations where I come from. So then there is a responsibility for making sure that if an organization is funded a particular way, that pay discrepancies have to be regulated to a certain extent, that pay has to be, that there's minimums that are set up. But we have we have a minimum wage in the UK, but we also have a living wage. They're two different things, which in itself is ridiculous. Like, but it means that a lot of organizations that get a lot of money are able to be a living wage employer, which then, you know, it's the sort of stamp you get, and it's then something everyone aspires to do. But as a small organization, it's impossible. Like, it's impossible to meet that, and it's impossible to meet that when, at a time when we're all kind of, our pay discrepancies are a lot smaller than in the bigger institutions. And that's not being regulated. And I think there should be pressure on regulating, yes, minimum pay or like pay standards, but also like discrepancies, because you might think, you know, even if you could think that you get what you deserve, I still think there's no justification for then having someone who's on 5 times the same amount of money. Like, I just don't, you know. And I don't think there's a lot of pressure on that in general, because then it becomes like, well, that's the organization and they're free to do with that as they wish. I think it goes back as well to like creating more horizontal structures or democratic structures, in which case you wouldn't have that problem.
So you're talking more about redistribution of the money that is there for the bigger institutions, or for the, yeah. I mean, Benjamin, you have spoken to the funders and politics in Austria. How is their reaction? Are they, because I mean, when I speak to politicians, they're always like on our side, but nothing changes. So how,
yeah,
is there anything?
It's the same in Austria. And really, they don't want to take on this responsibility, because we also talk to them and propose to them the idea that they themselves should take on more responsibility when it comes to overseeing the projects they fund. And I think it's really like this Gordischer Knoten, like this unsolvable puzzle, because the funding institutions also know that if festivals were to pay fair wages, then they as funding institutions would either need to provide more money, or they would have less film festivals, because there would simply be a lot of film festivals that would go out of business. And of course, for us as a forum of film festivals, this cannot be the solution to have then, because it would basically mean that we have 20 film festivals less in our forum and we remain with 3 film festivals. So I think it really needs more funding. I mean, it's even if you redistribute the funds in a festival, there's only so much you can do. If you don't pour more money into cultural funding, you will end up with less film festivals if you implement fair wages. So it needs more money. I mean, we've been talking about this for quite some time, and really we haven't come up with a different solution. But if any of you have any other ideas, I'd be very happy to hear them. But to me, it's like, yeah, how else do you solve the problem?
Katja, you kind of saw your hand moving?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I completely agree, but on the other hand, without the Fair Pay initiative of the Federal Ministry for Culture in Austria, my payment wouldn't have been raised. So there is this symbolic or political value of a lobby group like the Forum Österreichischer Filmfestivals as well, you know, that at least creates some kind of knowledge and some kind of public discussion about the working conditions at film festivals. And I see there has been quite a bit of change in Austria because of that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I also have these radical fantasies of people joining the union festival workers and then walking out at film festivals to really like make this strong sign. But when we had, I mean, I was also part of this fair festival work initiative, but to me it was also a little bit disillusioning that really the response of festival workers was extremely limited. And in the end, we ended up with a couple of festival directors and you, Katja, and one or two other like really motivated people. But to me, it's really hard to wrap my head around, because there are other people like you, Katja, who've been working for film festivals for a long time and who like piece together their year with different film festivals. And I'm always wondering where the fight is that those people put up, because I mean, in the end, we as the forum are representing employers. So I'm always wondering, okay, where are the employees? Even though in film festivals, as I said in the talk, it's sometimes not really that clear where the line runs between this division between employers and employees. I'm still like, I would like to see more festival workers stand up for fair pay.
But isn't there also a thin line? Because what I'm, like from my own personal experience, for example, in Dresden, we have this network of cultural institutions and we're campaigning a lot for fair pay and fair funding, but we're also doing it outside of our working hours. So we are writing letters, petitions. I'm running 3 social media channels, which is horrible. And we're doing that on top of our work. And I totally understand that people don't have the energy, because quite frankly, I don't really have the energy. And so how can we make it better for workers to also collaborate, maybe also on a more international level? How can we encourage workers to also go that step and campaign?
Join a union.
Because the union does it for us?
I'm very serious, because that's the reason why the initiative in Germany then decided to become part of a union instead of being a self-run initiative that's unfunded for extra work on top. Because if you manage to be a subdivision in a union, you have someone who is paid. That's a union worker who is paid to fight for the rights. And then it's not just you, but it's the person who actually knows the regulations and the structures and can advise in all directions, can advise in legal terms for the individual problems, but also the political structures and how to try and go forward. And at least for Germany, I know the person who's now in charge of the arts and culture department in Verdi, Lisa Basten. She came from that, she really wants to work, especially also with the festival sector a lot. And if you have people in there, then they can, I think, do and help the people who don't have the actual time and energy. Plus, the more who are in there, I think the more transparent it hopefully becomes what payment actually is, because a lot of young people who start in the industry have no clue what to ask for, because at least in Germany, and I think in many other countries as well, is this weird idea of you don't talk about money.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to include our wonderful audience. I saw already one hand there. I don't have, you can take, I'll do the walking, because I love walking so much.
Thank you very much. I go back to what Benjamin said about the estimation or not existing estimation of festivals within the whole funding system in regard to production or cinemas. And do you think that this is also one of the problems, because it's clear that it has to go more money for festivals, but the fact that it didn't happen in the last years, I think it's a problem of this estimation of what's the meaning, what's the significance of festivals for the whole industry, actually.
This was a huge part of the first years of the work of the Forum, was exactly this, to convince funding institutions that film festivals play an important role in the whole of the film industry. And this is also why we did this study in 2016, because the focus on the social situation of the festival workers was only a small part, but the bigger part was very much the economic impact of film festivals. And this, I think, had a huge effect on funding institutions and made them aware that film festivals play a big part. And I would attribute increase in funding also in part to this work, but also, as I said, in part to the change in political personnel. And this is, on the one hand, it's a good experience, because we saw, okay, people can change their perspectives, but on the other hand, it also introduces this factor of just being lucky that you find the right person you can talk to and convince them. This also plays a huge part. But I think it helps when you have when you have some sort of study or something that you did not come up with by yourself, but something that you can point to and say, okay, the economic effect of a film festival is, if you give us €1 of funding, we put 4 more euros into the economy. And this is something we did, and this helped us. Yeah.
Is that you? Okay, any other questions while I'm down here?
So yeah, with Anne mentioned the idea of like doing less programs. So I wonder if you've met directors, festival directors or festivals who have considered the idea of like just, well, a sustainable growth. So not like just doing more every year, but a sustainable growth. And also in your study, Benjamin, I was wondering if from like asking employees if like the conditions, because also not just the salary, but also the conditions was an issue, like the hours, like in the job, or like insurance and stuff like that. Is that an issue that came up, or? Yeah.
So to answer the second part of the question, no, that was not included in the study, and that's also why I think, Skadi, your study is very interesting. Because, of course, it is not only the pay, but also the working conditions, as you mentioned, and I think that's something that either you discuss it alongside fair wage, or it's definitely something that has to come after fair wage, is the working conditions. Because I know from my personal experience, as anyone who has ever worked at a film festival, that it's very, working conditions are not healthy at film festivals. And regarding the first part of your question, we as a forum, we represent 23 film festivals, and they are really insanely diverse, and also their history. There are festivals that have been around for 60 years, like the Biennale, and there's festivals that have been around for 2 or 3 years. And this idea of doing less programs with the amount of money you have is something that that comes up every once in a while, but you can clearly see that it is very hard for the festival managers to really commit to less programming, because they and I think it makes sense, and I understand it, because then they have the fear that the funding will decrease. If you slash your festival in half and you keep doing that for 2 or 3 years, you might run into the situation where you have to justify that with the funding institutions. And then I think there's like the younger festivals that have really this huge idealism, and they burn. They're like they really they want to do a festival, and they don't care whether or not they get paid. And I think the problem is that festivals start out like this, and there's a lot of festivals that have started out like this, with people that just work for free and volunteer. And then after some years, you have like established this 10-day festival with 100 programs, and then the old people quit and go somewhere else because they cannot afford to work anymore. And so then you bring in people that are not this founding generation and that get paid for their work, but you have a festival of 10 days, and all the funding you get depends, or you think it depends on the length of your festival. So then you're like caught in this situation where you think you need to maintain the quantity of programming. So I think I have no answer for you, unfortunately, but I think it's a really tricky and tough situation.
Let's speak to the festivals on the stage. Sanne and
I
Katja.
really need to object right away. The 2 festivals I am co-organizing, Queer Tactics and Red Lotus Asian Film Festival Vienna, both set out to pay everybody aside from myself and the other person leading the festival as fair as we can, and we don't do more than we can afford. And this is exactly one of the major reasons why I was interested in founding new festivals in the first place, because I think it's possible. And the model you describe, it sounds as if it was natural, but it's not, you know? And I think the first step before doing anything else is thinking about the working conditions you are creating when founding a festival.
Yeah, I was really surprised after when everything kind of started going back to physical festivals after the pandemic, that, and this is no shade on anyone, but the scale at which some events were coming back, where I think like building back better can mean building back smaller. And I think if enough of us start to understand and implement that, then there has to be an acceptance from our funders for that as well. And we're definitely, like, we did a smaller scale program for the 2022 edition, and I'm planning to go even smaller this year. I don't know how that will be received. At this point, I don't really care. But I think it is, like, you know, that means that there are things that we can compensate fairly that we weren't able to before. Though I would say that I think program costs aren't the biggest chunk of what we do. Like, it's always staff costs. It's always going to be staff costs. Like, it's not like a proportional thing, right? So, but I've noticed there's the Scottish Queer Film Festival who proposed this in their application to the funders, where they asked for more staff budget, but we're doing a smaller program that was a lot more focused on access and inclusion, and they got pushed back on that, and so I expect that we will get pushed back on it. But I think it doesn't. I think the trend does need to go there. You know, most of us start from volunteer-run projects at one point or another. And so at some point you get to this scale that is not really justified on anything apart from that you got to this scale and you started getting money, and they were like, you can do this for this money, so we're going to make you do this for this money. And I just think we need to go the entire opposite direction.
We have time for one more question or comment. Anybody in the audience? I mean, I know there's a lot of festivals here. Maybe you want to... Are you cutting down on your programs? Anyone? You are? You want to comment?
No, just to confirm that, yeah, this is the direction. So from 2 years already, I'm saying that we are going in the... We're going to make cuts in the programming because... it's just too much for the production side of the festival. So, and this is madness with, especially with the traveling programs, for example, which are offered for free, which you ongoing before was always adding to the program, because why not to screen another great retrospective which is offered for free without any costs? But then, of course, the cost of the work of the production department, of the curators, of everybody in the team is just like enormous. So we are aiming towards like limiting the competitions and also limiting the number of retrospectives, but just to screen them more often, because we put so much effort into making the archive programs, and then there's one program which is screened once, and then this is madness. So we want to limit the program, sharpen the vision, and just have more repetitions of the existing program to allow people also to catch up with it, because not everybody has 5 or 10 days to see the full program, every day full program. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to join you back on stage. So I guess what we should do and should continue is also the conversation about this, and maybe also connect more on an international level, learn from each other, and keep the conversation going. All join a union, I think. We'll do that today, right after there. We can all sign up. I just want to finish maybe on a positive note, or like with a little anecdote I found. The Canadian filmmaker, I'm going back to filmmakers now. The Canadian filmmaker Scott Fitzgerald, him and a couple of other filmmakers were raising the question of screening fees, and at every screening, at every Q&A they were mentioning if they got paid a screening fee or not. And after years of campaigning and discussions with the festival director of Ann Arbor Film Festival, the festival has now, or last year, implemented screening fees for all films in competition. So maybe we can learn from that and work from it together, and also like take this, going back to what Skadi said, mention ask for free. I'm stating that I am not getting paid for this panel. Thank you very much. It was a very fruitful conversation, and maybe we can also discuss it afterwards and continue talking. Thank you.